Hello. Today, I will be sharing with you all of my thoughts and reviews for every single book that I read last year. Chills. Hello friends, my name is Lexi and welcome back to my channel. Today is a very exciting day because today I'm going to be talking to you about 61 books in a single video. The only objective today is to show you every single book that I read last year and then tell you just a very quick brief synopsis. We are going to be covering 61 books, and so I might give you just my random opinion on a book, or I might go a little bit more in depth. Honestly, I don't know. There's no plan. There's no script. We're drinking tea and we're talking about books. Without further ado though, let's just go ahead and jump right into every single one of the books that I read last year. By the way, these are not going to be in any order whatsoever. The first book that I read last year was That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon by Kimberly Lemming. This was hot. If you love fantasy, you love romance, and you love a comedy, you need to pick this up. The scenes were quite steamy, but also it was just really funny. Like, I don't think I've ever laughed more from a book in my entire life. I just changed the camera angle so that you can see more of the books. You're welcome. The next romance I read was Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This is not a steamy, smutty book. This romance is more of like a fade to black romance following a girl named Theodora Eddings, who unfortunately has been cursed to only have half of her soul by a fairy. She ends up teaming up with Elias and they try to get her soul back. Extremely romantic, absolutely beautiful. This is what I would consider to be like a cozy fantasy. And like the scenes of this book have stuck with me all year long. One of the best romances I've ever read. I love it. I love it with my whole heart. Next up is a cozy mystery called Shady Hollow by Juno Black. This book is like if a murder happened in the 100-Acre Woods and Winnie the Pooh was trying to solve it. Except I bet you if it was actually in Winnie the Pooh, it would have been a little bit more exciting. Okay, now this next one I would say has almost too much excitement. This scared the actual out of me. And that is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This is a YA book and we are following senior Pip. Now Pip decides to make her senior project all about a girl named Andy Bell who mysteriously went missing and was murdered. She believes that the person who was convicted of her murder was wrongfully convicted and she wants to try to prove his innocence. This one scared me. This one literally scared me so much. I ended up making the mistake of reading this alone at my house at night, and I do not recommend that. I do not recommend that. I do, however, recommend the book. It was really well done. Next up was another murder mystery. This is a literary fiction murder mystery, and it is called I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Mackay. I actually think this would be considered more of like a thriller mystery and literary fiction. And this book is following Thalia. Thalia used to go to this preparatory school when she was younger. There was a girl who was murdered, I believe, in her class, and then she returns years later when she is a grown-up person, basically to teach at the school. It's about her rediscovering this case and trying to crack it as an adult. And it's interesting. It has like some very interesting questions that it brings up, I think, to the readers. I felt like at times it was thought-provoking, but overall, it just felt a little too slow to be considered a thriller for me. Next up, we have an adorable middle grade called Frostheart by Jamie Littler. This is precious in every single way. We're following Ash. Ash has unfortunately lost his parents or been separated from his parents, and he is in the custody or the guardianship, the care, if you will, from a Yeti guardian named Tobu. Tobu and Ash end up going on an adventure together when Ash is basically accepted to be a crew member on this enormous sled, and the sled is like going from town to town, and Ash is convinced he is going to try to find out what happened to his parents. It's a beautiful fantasy. It's really engaging, really fast-paced. I loved the illustrations in this. I thought it was so funny, and honestly, Ash is so precious. I love him, I love the crew members, and I love his adorable Yeti guardian, Tobu. Next up is Holly Black's newest book. Is it the new? Oh, it was the newest at the time. It might not be the newest now. Anyways, and that is The Stolen Heir, again by Holly Black. This is a YA, fae, fantasy, thing. This, again, takes place in the Fae world. I would say this is like less toxic than the Cruel Prince series, and it's more of like a friends to lovers romance between Surin and Oak. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was really, really good. If you like Fae fantasy type things and you love Holly Black but you haven't picked it up, I think maybe you should check it out. Next up is the newest, it's not the newest now, but it was at the time. Lost in the Moment and Found by Sean McGuire. This was the newest novella in her Wayward Children series. And this book follows Ancy, and Ancy runs away from home when her home life becomes a little bit of a nightmare, and she ends up finding herself in the shop for lost things. This is a great portal fantasy. If you love Sean McGuire's series and you have not picked up her newest novella, I loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It ended up being in my top 10 best books of the year. I just love every single book in the series, honestly. They're all novellas. I think if you love portal fantasy and you have not given this series a go, you should. Next up, I read a short story collection by Kate Folk called Out There, and this is an adult feminism, slightly sci-fi in tone collection of short stories. I really enjoyed this. I feel like it's kind of difficult when you are reviewing a collection of short stories because you're obviously going to connect to some short stories more than others, but I actually remember the premise of so many of these short stories. One had like a head coming out of the floor. Like it's weird, like the head grew every single day out of the floor, which was really interesting. Another one was about how a girl was going out. It was like with a bot or something, basically. It was interesting. Like, I can't explain it. Some of these were just so well done and so fascinating and so interesting, and they honestly have stuck with me, and I highly recommend it. Like, if you love short stories, I think you should read this. Next up, I read a couple different mangas. So I read Witch Hat Atelier #2 and also Witch Hat Atelier #3. This series is following Coco, and Coco desperately wishes that she could create magic / she could become a witch. In the very first volume of this manga series, she learns that you actually can learn magic, that technically anybody can learn magic, but that it's kind of more of like a guarded secret. And in this world, magic is basically conducted through the art of drawing, which I thought was a really, really cool take. And volume 2 and 3, they're just kind of following Coco in her shenanigans as she is learning how to become a witch. I love these, okay? I think they are so fun. I think they are so whimsical and so charming and so lighthearted. I'm pretty sure I gave both of these 5 out of 5 stars. I think you should pick them up. If you like manga and that sounds good to you, the vibes are wholesome, whimsical, cute, perfect. Next up, I picked up The Villa by Rachel Hawkins. This is an adult thriller. The Villa is a really interesting concept because it was loosely sort of inspired by Mary Shelley. We're following a fictitious writer who essentially is supposed to represent Mary Shelley and like all of the things that Mary Shelley went through the summer that she wrote Frankenstein. And so parts of the book are told from this fictitious author's perspective as she is writing her book in the villa, I think in Italy. And then the other parts of the book are following Emily. Emily and her best friend Chess are both writers, and they decide to rent the villa where this fictitious author wrote her story. And also there's like another layer because on top of all this, there were a bunch of murders that happened in this villa. And we're kind of watching a bunch of things unfold. We're watching a lot of tension between Emily and her bestie. We are also trying to figure out what murders took place when this fictitious author was writing her version of Frankenstein. It sounds kind of complicated, but you get it as you read it. I'm glad I read it. It was an interesting take. I don't think it was the best thriller I've ever read, but it was definitely very unique. The next book that I read was one of the best romances I've ever read in my life, and it's called 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. This particular book is following two authors who kind of fall in love when they are younger, and then when they grow up, they lose contact with each other and they both become writers. And then they end up writing each other into all of their stories. So every single one of their books is sort of kind of like a love letter to the other. And this book is about what happens when they meet up as adults in New York City at a book convention. It's steamy, it's hot, it's wonderful, it's perfect. I loved it. Speaking of romance and all things I love, I also loved Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. This one is really, really sad. I will say that 7 Days in June is also tonally a little bit more serious. Like, yes, it is romantic and beautiful, but also there are some really tragic parts in that. And I think there are some tragic parts in this as well. This particular book is following two people who meet one day at a Chicago museum. They end up being really fascinated by the other person, and they decide to have like 10 different conversations to see if they can learn a lot about the other one. But they're not dates at first, and they fall in love, and it's really stunning. The next one is an adult gothic tale with some sapphic undertones. It's called The Last Tale of the Flower Bride, and this is by Roshani Chokski. This is for anybody who is looking for a modern gothic tale, especially if you also love fairy tale elements and you like the macabre, you like more sad, odd tones of things. You might really be interested in this. We're following Indigo, and Indigo has just married her husband, and she ends up sort of being an enigma to him. She has a very dark past that she is a little bit more secretive of, and her dark past has these beautiful elements of like almost fantasy and fairy tales. You learn a lot about her and about one of her best friends that she had growing up, and about their at times toxic and very complex, complicated friendship. This book, I will just tell you, left me feeling so ill, as all great gothic lit does, okay? Gothic lit is not supposed to be wrapped up pretty in a bow. And I think this one definitely made me feel very uncomfortable, ill at ease. It's not really what I would consider to be a thriller, but it had some really dark and interesting moments. And while I was reading this, I was really on the fence. I either loved it or I hated it. And I think that really speaks to how great the writing is, because if writing can make you feel that range of like emotions between I hate this, I love this, but it's also so good I can't stop reading this, I think it shows that it's a really great book. I did enjoy this, but I'm not sure if I'm ever gonna read it again. The next book I did was a little bit of a reread. I reread The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, and this is by Zoraida Cordova. This is an adult magical realism story following Orquídea Divina. Orquídea Divina is a woman with an interesting past, and basically what she does one day is she gathers up all of her children and she says, "You guys, I'm dying, and it's time for you to collect your inheritance." The inheritance is very different from what people think it is. The story is told in different perspectives, sort of. We're following Orquídea Divina as she's growing up, and we see like what she's gone through and how she's become the woman that she has become. We also follow the lives of really 3 of her grandchildren, and how her magic and how her life has sort of touched and influenced them. It's a story about resilience and love and family. It's a 5 out of 5. Love it so much. The next one that I read is Keeper of Enchanted Rooms. This is a book that I found from Kindle Unlimited. I read this with my Patreons. This was our very first book club book pick of 2023. And it was really, really cute. It was cozy. It's about our main protagonist who inherits a family house, and the family house, well, think Encanto, okay? Like, it's a little bit magical. And the house sort of like traps him in so he can't leave. And he ends up getting sent this woman, I think named Hilda, and Hilda works for a magical house association, and she's there to help him and like guide him through the process of owning a magical house. It's a cozy mystery, it's a fantasy, and it also has elements of a romance. I loved it. I thought it was really, really charming, and if you love cozy, wholesome tales, you'll like this. It did have some scary elements, but I enjoyed it, and I didn't think it was too much to be considered not a cozy fantasy / cozy mystery, but I mean, cozy to each their own. The next one that I read is a little novella called Empress of Salt and Fortune, and this is by Niveau. This is a political allegory story, and it's complicated. It's a little bit hard to kind of explain. I think one of the strongest points of this novella was the writing. I really liked it. I thought it was cool. Next up, we have a middle grade. This is a mystery middle grade. It's called The Swifts, A Dictionary of Scoundrels, and this is by Beth Lincoln with illustrations by Claire Powell. The illustrations in here, by the way, were so charming and cute. Let me see if I can show you one. Adorable! This book is following Shenanigan Swift, and Shenanigan Swift is born into a really interesting family. They basically just opened the family dictionary, randomly pointed a word, and that is your name. And then not only is that your name, but it's also kind of considered your identity. It's seen almost like predicting your name is predicting who you're going to be, and you're upheld to those certain standards that come with your name. Her whole family gets together for a big family reunion, and while they are there, her grandmother is murdered, and Shenanigan Swift is going to figure out what happened to her granny. This was great. This was so good. It was not too scary for middle grade. I thought it was really, really well paced. I thought it was cozy. I loved every single character, and again, thematically, very strong. One of the best middle grades I've ever read. Super, super good. Next, we've got one of my favorite cozy fantasies of all time, Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. Love this one so much. Tress falls in love with a guy named Charlie. Charlie is kidnapped and Tress has to go on a mission and save him. It's romantic, it's heroic, it's adventurous, and it's also, yes, very, very cozy. There's also a talking mouse in this, okay? And that was a good time. Next up, we have a YA fantasy called Six Crimson Cranes, and this is by Elizabeth Lim. This was so freaking good. Oh my gosh. We're following Shiori. Shiori is a princess, and she is cursed by her stepmother, the queen. Her brothers all become cranes, and she cannot speak. And she goes on this mission to save her brothers and herself. And it's beautiful. There's romance, there's thrills, there's a love triangle, but like done correctly, okay? There's a dragon in here. I love any book that has to do with a dragon. I really, really do. Next up, we've got a little nonfiction. Let's pepper in some nonfiction. I read Stephen King's On Writing, which is his memoir, and also an advice book to people who are interested in learning more about the craft of writing and how he creates his stories. This was really good. This was super unexpected. I picked this up really so that I could pick up more tips on how to become a stronger writer. Read this book and I was really touched. Like, I was really emotional learning all about his life and all about his struggles, all about the first time that he sold his very first manuscript, which was for Carrie, about how he wanted to throw it away, but his wife actually rescued it from the trash and said, I think you need to take another look at this. I think that this is actually really good. We look at his career, his family, who he is as a person, his childhood, and also there is some really great practical writing advice. I really loved this. I thought it was great, and it was very inspirational to me. The next book is another nonfiction that I read, and it's called Come As You Are by Emily Nagasaki. And this is the surprising new science that will transform your sex life. Listen, I'm all about sex positivity. I thought it was a really interesting read, and I'm glad I read it. The next book I read is Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson, adult literary fiction following 3 different sisters who all are wealthy, okay? They're rich people and they live in New York City, and it's following their privilege, but also the drama that comes in their life. It was messy and really funny and really interesting, and I liked it. I liked it a lot. I like rich people drama, I do. Next up, I read a couple different books for Summerween. The first one was a middle grade called Wretched Water Park, and this is by Kirsten White, all about 2 siblings, technically 3, but 2 twins who go into a water park, and the water park is not what it seems to be, okay? There's monsters in the water park, and it's a little spooky. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was cute, lighthearted, and a great summer read for kids. The next one that I read for Summerween was What Lives in the Woods, and this is by Lindsay Curry. This is a great middle grade, all about, what's her name? I don't know. All about Ginny, and Ginny and her family end up going in the middle of nowhere one summer, and her dad, it's kind of hard to explain. He like gives his diagnosis on historic houses and how he thinks they can be fixed up to preserve their history and also look really nice. He moves his family into one of those historic mansion houses, and it just so happens to be haunted. It was really good. It was a fun time. The next one I read for Summerween was The Only One Left, and this is by Riley Sager. This is an adult thriller following Lenora and Kit. Lenora is an old woman who is in a retirement home right now. Well, technically she's in this house, which has been kind of converted into a nursing home for her, but it's her house that she grew up in. And she was found years and years and years earlier with everyone in her family fully dead. And she was just like covered in their blood, and she hasn't been able to speak since. And so everyone thinks that she sort of went crazy and killed everyone in her family. However, there was not enough evidence to suggest that she did this, and she has not spoken since, so we don't really know the truth. Then Kit is hired sort of to become her caretaker in this house. She has to stay in the house where all of the murders took place, which is really creepy. Lenora decides one day to type on her typewriter, "Let me tell you what actually happened." And Kit is trying to figure out, can she trust this lady or is she lying? It was good. It was really interesting. If you like Riley Sager and you like a good thrillery type of plot twisty book, you're gonna like it. There are a lot of plot twists in here. I know some people said that like the ending was kind of ridiculous, but honestly, I think as long as you're entertained, who cares, you know? And I was thoroughly entertained. And then I think these are the last two books I read for Summerween. The first one is You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Kaitlyn Byron. This is a YA thriller. This was so well done. This is following a camp counselor who goes to camp, and the camp is like an immersive experience. It's not actually a camp. You go there for like a day to be really scared, and it's kind of almost, it's hard to explain. It's like a play. They're walking you through like a haunted house that's interactive, and the whole thing is a camp. And so if you're a teenager and you go to this camp, you're pretending that you're trying to survive from a killer. And the camp counselors all get together and really try to make it interactive. And it's just like a scary, scary night for anybody who wants to participate. Well, anyways, Charity is our main protagonist. She is a camp counselor. She's one of the main actresses. And she realizes during one of the nights at camp that there are actual camp counselors and her friends who are disappearing. And she thinks maybe there is actually a killer on the loose. And it's good. And then the final book that I read for that little readathon is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This is Carmen Maria Machado's short story collection. They are like feminist stories. They're weird. They're like surrealism. I think there's some magical realism in here as well, some sci-fi elements. And I didn't care for this. I didn't like this at all, actually, which is kind of a bummer to say. However, while I did not enjoy her short story collection, I did really enjoy her memoir In the Dream House. I thought this was phenomenal and a 5-star read and really, really well done. If you're gonna pick up something from this author, I think you should pick this one up. However, I know that her short story collection is very, very beloved. So if you are interested, maybe check it out. But I didn't particularly like it very much. It's just a bummer because I really thought I was gonna love it. Next up, we have my man, Grady Hendrix. I read this for Gabby's book club. It's called How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. All about two siblings who come together when their parents die and they have to try to sell their parents' house, and then they find out that the house is haunted. And there are puppets involved, and it is a creepy, spooky good time. Loved it so much. I particularly really enjoy how Grady Hendrix explores different types of love. This particular love that was explored is the sibling love, and how no one quite understands you or your childhood the way your brother or your sister would, and how while maybe like sibling dynamics aren't always perfect, a lot of the times it's a very strong bond and one that can be really counted on. It was good. I loved it. I thought it was really great. It was a 5-star read, so yeah. Okay, next up is The Marvelers, and this is by Daniela Clayton. This is a middle grade. The book is following Ella, and Ella has been invited to attend a magical school. However, the school sucks, okay? Everyone's rude to her, everyone's mean to her. Thematically, I think it's a great book, I think, to introduce to kids and show them like the injustices that are currently still happening today in today's world. But also, like, reading it, you're gonna feel really frustrated and upset for the character the whole time. I would say the writing in this is really great, and again, I think thematically it's very strong, and this is a really important middle grade, but it's not necessarily an enjoyable read because the whole time you're really, really angry at how everyone is treating Ella. It's not a school I would recommend going to, okay? They all sound so stuck up and racist. The next one is one of my very favorite books of the entire year, and that is The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi, and this is by Shannon Chakraborty. This is an adult epic fantasy, and it's perfect in every single way. We're following Amina. Amina is a retired pirate, and she is persuaded to go back into being a pirate to rescue the granddaughter of some rich lady who like pays her. So she's like, Amina, I know you're retired. I think you're the only person who could rescue my granddaughter. Here's a lot of money. And Amina's like, okay, got you. Let me call up all my besties and we will go save your granddaughter. Every single chapter was like an adventure. Every single chapter was hilarious. Every single chapter was literally like a movie. Like this just felt so episodic. It felt like I was watching an incredible Netflix series. I really love this book a lot. I highly recommend it. There are some heavier topics and it does get really, really dark towards the end, but I enjoyed it so much. Like it was just, it was everything. Next up is another middle grade called Eva Evergreen, the Semi-Magical Witch, and this is by Julie Abe. This has some major Kiki's Delivery Service vibes. I thought it was so wonderful. It's wholesome, it's whimsical, it's charming. It's a 5-star read. Could not recommend it more. Super, super cute. Now let's pause so that I can give you a little bit of a backstory on some of these books. At some point in the year, I decided to go on a self-improvement journey, if you will, and decided to listen to self-improvement books, almost like a podcast. Not all of them were created equal, but here are some of those self-improvement nonfiction books that I read. The first one that I read is Atomic Habits, and this is by James Clear. This is a book that gives you practical advice all about habits and why it's super important to build habits and the impact that habits can have in your life. I actually really enjoyed this one. I really liked some of the messages. One of, I think, the strongest messages in here is how if you want to improve your life, it's actually small, tiny changes that you do consistently that's going to have a lasting, longer, better impact. Next up, I read Big Magic, and this is by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is another one that I really enjoyed. It's all about how to become more creative and how to tap into your creative thoughts. I liked it. I thought it was really interesting, and I also really enjoyed the little story that she shared about Ann Patchett and her and their friendship. I really liked it a lot. If you are somebody who is creative and you want to tap more into your creativity, maybe pick this up. I thought it was really enjoyable. Next up, I read You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero, and this is sort of like every self-help book that you've ever heard of, except it's done in a funny way. So if you are familiar with like self-improvement books, I don't know that this necessarily tells you anything different, but if you're looking for like a fun, positive, you can do it type of a book said in a really funny way, I liked it. I enjoyed the audiobook. I thought it was funny, and it did actually make me feel pretty positive. I don't think everything in here was 100% accurate, but I do like the positivity that came in parts of this book. I thought it was really funny and interesting. Then I read probably my favorite self-improvement book. It's called The Power of Habit. This is by Charles Duhigg. It wasn't so much about self-improvement as it was breaking down the science behind a habit and like why people actually change their life. And I liked this because I feel like there was so much science, so much data, and so many personal stories that he used to really back up a lot of the claims and how certain principles scientifically can be implemented into people's lives and why certain things work versus certain things don't work. Then I read Awaken the Giant Within by Tony Robbins. I thought this was okay. He also came from a really hard background. He is completely self-made, and he does tell you practical principles about things that helped him get through some of the dark periods of his life, and I really appreciate that. It was an interesting read. The next one is called The Mountain Is You, and this is by Brianna Weist. You know what? I don't think I like this one. It's not that it was bad. It's just that I feel like this doesn't really give you anything to help you. It more states like the obvious. Like I remember listening to a part of this. One of the advice is if you're sad, you need to clean your house. And you also need to exercise, and you need to drink water, and you need to do all this stuff. And it's like, well, no duh. Like, obviously, but like, how do you do that? How do you find time to manage all of the things in your life so that you can be a productive person? Because of course, you're gonna be less depressed if your house is clean and you're exercising and you're dating the right people. But I don't really feel like the book gives you practical tools to actually achieve any of these things or cite from like any credible sources. It just tells you the obvious. Like, are you sad? Clean your room. Whereas I think the other books arguably at least try to break down steps into how to be a little bit more of a successful person. I know that this is very, very beloved by so many people. I can see why, but for me personally, I just think that this would have been more helpful if we had been given like steps and tools on how to implement the advice in here instead of just advice. The next one I read is The Vacationers by Emma Straub. This is an adult literary fiction about a family who goes to an island for the summertime, and they have a lot of things that are not being said. And this is about the summer that everything kind of all comes up to the surface. It's interesting if you like rich people problems, if you like family dynamic stories, I think maybe check it out. The next book I read is another nonfiction. It's a memoir. It's called Just Kids by Patti Smith, and we are exploring what it's like to be a struggling artist, kind of like in the 1960s, 1970s in New York City. We're following her and her relationship with her best friend. They are both trying to become artists, and it's about like the music at the time, it's about the art, the photography at the time. It's also a beautiful portrayal of her friendship with Robert, who is the platonic soulmate and love of her life. It's really beautiful. I thought it was really interesting. I enjoyed learning more about the 1960s and 70s in New York City and about all of the art at the time. I thought it was like a really fascinating nonfiction. Last December, I read The Kingdom of Sweets, and this is by Erica Johnson. This is a adult fantasy nutcracker retelling, except we're also following Clara and her fictional twin sister, and one of them is the good sister and one of them is the bad sister. The Kingdom of Sweets in the Nutcracker is not all that it seems in the book. Was okay. I read One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. I ended up DNFing this, you guys. Like, I was not a fan. This is a Romeo and Juliet retelling, but honestly, it just felt kind of convoluted towards the end. I feel like there were way too many plots, way too many characters, and the characters didn't really feel super distinct. If you're gonna pick up anything from Olivia Blake, I think personally, I would recommend Alone with You in the Ether. Such a fantastic work. One of my favorite books of the year. This one just didn't work for me, and that's okay. Next up, I read another book that sadly didn't really work for me. It's called Once Upon a River, and this is by Diana Setterfield, and this is an adult literary fiction / historical fiction, all about a child who is rescued from the Seine River, and everyone claims to have ownership of this child. Like, people are claiming like, that's my granddaughter, that's my daughter, that's my long lost sister's best friend. No, I'm just kidding. But like, everyone seems to think that this child belongs to them, and it's about all of their backstories and how all of their stories are connected and how this child fits into everyone's story. It was interesting. I personally prefer Diane Setterfield's Gothic tale, The 13th Tale, over this one, but the writing in it was really beautiful and lush and lyrical. I just thought that the pacing of this was a little bit too slow for me. Next up, I read The Nest, and this is by Cynthia Sweeney. You don't need to read that. The next book I have here is A Psalm for the Wild Build, and this is by Becky Chambers. This is a sci-fi little novella story all about a robot, and the robot meets Dex, and Dex is a monk that serves tea to people. And the robot is essentially trying to learn all about humanity through Dex. It's really interesting. I thought parts of this were really beautiful and had a really great, strong message. I think it's worth the read, especially if you love cozy sci-fi type books. Becky Chambers did such a great job. Next up, we have another memoir. This one is Britney Spears, The Woman in Me. This was juicy. This was so juicy. Oh my gosh, there were so many times where I was audibly gasping out loud. It's a really sad book, or a really sad memoir. I felt so bad for Britney. I felt like the media had just done her so dirty. I felt like her family had really just taken advantage of her and abused her, and I don't like them at all. They are off my Christmas list. And honestly, justice for Britney, you know? Next up, I have Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. I lost the cover. I don't know what happened to this. This is another one that I technically DNF'd. I didn't finish it. It's about a couple who are lying about something and they end up staying in an old chapel to kind of like get away for the winter together and rekindle their marriage, but they're hiding secrets. It's not that it was bad, it just like wasn't really gripping my attention at the time. Next up, I read You Again by Kate Goldbeck. This is an adult romance and it's also a When Harry Met Sally retelling. It's an enemies to friends, friends to lovers, sexy, fun romance. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. If you love When Harry Met Sally, maybe check it out. Next up, we have one of my very favorite books of the entire year, which is The Rules of Magic by Alice Hoffman. This is written by the same author who wrote Practical Magic. You can technically read the books in any order, I believe. I started with The Rules of Magic, which follows 3 siblings who are all living in New York City, and they end up discovering that they are witches, and they go to stay with, I think, their great aunt in Massachusetts, and they tap into their powers. It's a story that kind of sounds like it's a fantasy, but really magic sort of is more woven in as a garnish, if you will. The real meat and potatoes of this book is about love and about how love is so powerful and sad and heartbreaking and beautiful and completely worth all of the emotions that you go through to have it. It's an ode to love, basically. And my hopeless romantic ass loved it. Next up, I read Magic Lessons by Alice Hoffman. This chronologically is the first book that takes place in the series. We're following Maria Owens. Maria Owens famously has cursed all of the members of her family on accident so that like anybody who falls in love with them or any man who falls in love with an Owens woman will die. And this is her story. This is about how she fell in love and the curses that happened to her and the tragedy and the beauty and her relationship with her daughter. And it was really good. It was so good. Next up, I did a reread of Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, the peak of cozy fantasy. We're following Viv. Viv is an orc. She wants to retire from adventuring. She wants to serve people cappuccinos. We love this for her. It's about her really trying to create this really cozy, cute little magical coffee shop for people and have a happy little life. And I loved it. I loved it with my whole heart. This book is precious to me. I will hear no complaints or criticisms of it. It is God tier. Next up, I read a book. I read this for Kayla and Gabby's book clubs, and then my Wi-Fi didn't work. But I read this for their book club. It's called A Twisted Love Story by Samantha Shannon, all about a married couple and their twisted love story. I thought this was okay, but honestly, I much preferred Samantha Downing's other book, which was For Your Own Good. I think if you're gonna start anywhere, I would start with that one. I thought that the twist wasn't very strong at the end. I was just expecting a lot more twists and turns from it, but it wasn't a bad book. Next up, I read The Shining by my man, Stephen King. Loved this book so much. This is a book following a family who stays up in a hotel and the dad goes crazy and things get horrific. That doesn't sound like a good time. And I guess parts of this, I mean, it was definitely terrifying. So if you don't want to pick up a horror story, don't pick it up. But like if you like horror and you want to see it done really well, pick it up because it's a haunted hotel. It has a lot of really interesting and complex themes. It was gut-wrenching and powerful, and there are so many beautiful moments in here. Stephen King doesn't just write scary stuff. He writes beautiful stuff. Next, I finally finished Frankenstein, and this is by Mary Shelley. This is a classic all about Dr. Frankenstein who decides that he wants to animate life and bring a bunch of dead parts back together in the form of a man whom he calls the Creature. That's right. This guy does not even name the creature. He just calls it the Creature the whole time, and it's just awful. It's so awful. I cannot stand Dr. Frankenstein. It's about the creature and about seeing life from his perspective. In a lot of ways, this is a love letter to humanity and to what it's like to fall in love, to be alive, to belong to people, and also how isolating and sad it can be when you're looking at humanity from the outside and you don't feel like you belong, or you feel like you're different, or you feel like the person you've put so much trust and hope into has completely turned out into a monster and become a monster. Yeah, it was really good. It was really sad. I particularly loved every single thing from the creature's perspective. I thought it was fantastic. And Dr. Frankenstein can choke. The next book I read was The Narrow by Kate Alice Marshall, which is a YA sapphic ghost story and horror. I thought this was okay. I really wanted to love this on paper. It had everything I thought that I would love, but alas, I didn't really like this as much as I was hoping to. If you are going to pick up anything from Kate Alice Marshall though, I highly recommend checking out These Fleeting Shadows. That was a gothic story. Ugh. Done so well. Next up, I read Halloween Party. This is by Agatha Christie, and this is a classic whodunit. It's a murder mystery. And this particular book I read because Gavin and I were hosting a solve along murder mystery party with our Patreon members. This was fun. It's all about a child who mysteriously ends up murdered at a Halloween party, and then Monsieur Poirot has to go in and actually figure out what happened and who killed the child. It was really fun to try solving this. I did get some of it right, but not all of it. I really enjoy reading Agatha Christie. I just think she is the queen of murder mystery. And then I also read a cozy mystery called Death by Chocolate Chip Cupcake. And this was so good. Oh my gosh, I just got this from my local library. Highly recommend. All about two besties who run a bakery and they solve crimes in this cute little coastal town in their spare time. And they end up getting invited over to an old Hollywood starlet's mansion so that they could cater a party that she's throwing with all of her like little Hollywood friends. The mansion is crumbling and apparently it's haunted and it's atmospheric, okay? This reminded me sort of like an adult Scooby-Doo episode. It was really fun. I really enjoyed it and I loved all the descriptions of chocolate. Next up, I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, which is a cozy fantasy and love story following Emily Wilde, who chronicles her, I guess, interactions with the Fae. And it's also an enemies to lovers with her and my main man Wendell. And I will tell you what, I am in love with Wendell. If you love funny, lighthearted, cozy fantasies, and you also love the world of the Fae, you can't go wrong with this book. This book did it. And finally, the very last book that I have here, and then I think that will be all 61 books, is The Haunting of Evelyn Jones, and this is by Phil Hicks. This was my October book club pick for my Patreon members. We really enjoyed this, all about Evelyn Jones, who has to go and stay with her aunt when her mom has to visit her grandma, who is currently sick in the hospital. And while Evelyn is there, she finds a ghost story book and she learns about some local scary legends and lore, and she believes that she sees a ghost. And the ghost has this huge tragic backstory and it's scary. For a middle grade, I thought this was super chilling, super atmospheric, but mostly so scary. So if you're looking for a middle grade that is going to make you feel all the chills, but also is so well done and so cozy, definitely check this book out. There you have it, friends. Those are all 61 of the books that I have read this year. I had such a fun reading year. I don't know if I found a ton new favorites, but I did find quite a few that I loved. If you're interested in just finding out what my favorite books of the year are, you can actually check out my latest video, which was the best books that I read of 2023. I would love to know from you though, how many books did you read last year? And how many books do you want to read this year? Please let me know down below in a comment. And if you've made it to this part of the video, please leave me the tea emoji or the cup of tea, or is it a cup of coffee? I don't know. We're gonna pretend it's tea. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Also a huge thank you to all of my members over on Fox and Wood, my Patreon, especially the Ink and Quill Club members. Your support absolutely means the world to me. I love you guys so much, and until next time, book lovers, keep your head in the clouds and your heart in a book, and I will talk to you very soon. Bye.